Well, it's really great to be able to join with you. Don't we wish that we could all be together, but how wonderful that we can gather online like this. Well, I wonder if you've ever received a present that you knew in advance exactly what you were going to get. You knew before Christmas what you would be receiving. Maybe some clothes, and so mum and dad needed to try them on you before they bought them. Maybe it was something that you really, really wanted, and so a kind person promised to get it for you. Or maybe, perhaps for some of the grown-ups, you knew what you were going to get at Christmas because you had bought the present for yourself. Maybe I'm not the only one who's bought something, wrapped it and put it under the tree with my own name on it. Well, 2,000 years ago, God's people were expecting a present from God, and they knew exactly what they were going to get. They knew in advance it was going to be a king. Now, a king is a bit of a funny present, isn't it? Now, look, I've got a king here as a present. Here is a king, and he is a present. Isn't that an interesting way for a king to come as a present? If God was going to send a king to his people, do you think this is how he would do it? Well, if we were going to send a present to someone, what would we do? Maybe you've had to send a present to someone who you can't visit at Christmas. So what do? We send it through the post, don't we? Do you think that when it comes to God sending a king, he's going to do it through the post? Because this is how he'd have to do it, wouldn't he? Some brown paper, perhaps, and some masking tape, and some stamps, because you have to pay for the postage. So some stamps over there. And then, of course, you need a label. And so here's the address label to God's people at Dundonald Church, Wimbledon Chase Primary School. And so we stick that on, and there is the king ready to be sent. Do you think that's how God is going to send the king to his people? Well, I'm not quite sure, actually. King, why don't you walk off that direction in a more or less of a straight line, and you'll be okay. I don't think that's how God is going to send his king. What did Matthew say in that part of the Bible Ariana read for us about how God was going to send his king? Well, first of all, Matthew starts with some evidence about how we can be sure that this is true, that it really happened. Firstly, he tells us these things took place after Jesus was born. We're not told how long after, but notice down in verse 11, the Magi come to the house where Jesus is. So he's probably not still in the manger, even though the nativity scenes picture it that way. Second piece of evidence, Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea. This is where Israel's famous King David came from. And this is a real place. If we weren't in Tier 4, you could go on a plane and visit it tomorrow. And then thirdly, this was during the time of King Herod. He was known as Herod the Great. Pretty sure he gave himself that nickname. But he was king from about 40 BC to 4 BC. Now, don't get too worried about the 4 BC bit. The man who invented our calendar and system of dating, a man called Dionysius the Humble, who I think was another one who chose his own nickname, he got his dates mixed up a bit, and he was about 4 years out. So don't worry too much about that. This is quite close to the end of Herod's reign. So we know the time in Jesus' life, we know exactly where in the world these things are taking place, and we know at what point in world history this is all happening. So all the evidence says this is true and historical, but who is the king and how does God send him? Well, these people called the Magi help us understand. The Magi, Matthew tells us, came from the east. Magi were people who looked at the stars to try and predict the future and to understand what was going on in the world. And they've seen something that lets them know a king has been born. Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose. Now, we don't know any of the detail or how they know this means God has sent a king, but they understand God has sent his king as a baby. Now that might seem completely wrong to us. A king is usually strong and powerful and gives orders and marches around the place. And in fact, that's exactly what King Herod is like. He is the king in Jerusalem at the time. And yet the real king whom God sends, he sends as a baby. The king of God's kingdom enters the world as a tiny baby, exactly the way that you and I entered the world. See, God's kingdom is exactly the opposite to what we often expect. God's kingdom is not just about important people and things that are spectacular. God's kingdom is for ordinary people. People like you and me, people who get sad and upset and disappointed even at Christmas time. Lots of us have found this year hard, haven't we? School's been closed. Now, some of us might have thought that was pretty good for a little while, but sport has been cancelled as well, hasn't it? We haven't been able to see family and friends, and now we're not going to be able to do that at Christmas. But because God sent his king as a little baby who grew up and was a kid and a teenager and an adult, he knows what our life is like. God's king knows what it's like to feel sad and to be hurt. Jesus is a really good king to have. But there's a problem, isn't there? God's sending a king, but there's already a king. There's King Herod in Jerusalem and this new king who's been born. And as we see in verse 3, King Herod was none too pleased at the suggestion of a new king. When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. See, Herod called himself the king of the Jews. So for a new king to be born means that his reign is over, and he's not happy. And we know from history that when King Herod was not happy, he went around killing the people who made him unhappy. So we've got two kings. How do we work out which is the right one? That's an important question, isn't it? Who's in charge matters. It's why the American election has filled our news feeds for the past year. It matters who's in charge. Now, we don't have a king, we have a queen, but even what she does doesn't really affect us very much, does it? But there is absolutely someone in charge, someone we serve, a person or a thing that sets the direction of our life, someone we serve, something that helps us decide what's right and wrong. That famous philosopher Bob Dylan once sang, "You're going to have to serve somebody. Yes, indeed, you're going to have to serve somebody." So maybe we're the king. We live as if we're in charge. We serve ourselves. Or maybe it's the things that we like to do. Sport, hobbies, that's what we serve. Maybe it's our family. We put them first like they're the king. And you know what? Often we're just like King Herod. We don't like it when we learn there's a real king. We're going to think about that a bit more in a few minutes. But right now we're going to sing. Well, I wonder if you can remember the present that God had promised to send to his people. It was a king, wasn't it? And the way that God had promised to send the king, the way that he'd made these promises known, was through his word, the Bible. And we heard two of those promises in the second part of the story in Matthew's gospel account that we just read together. About 700 years before Jesus, a man named Micah brought the promises of God to his people. "But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." And that last line also contains a promise from the book of 2 Samuel, which was written even earlier than Micah. Now, our future king, Prince George, was born in the Lindo wing of St Mary's Hospital, which costs £8,000 a day. But that's not where God promised his king will come from. God's king is going to come from a tiny, tiny town called Bethlehem, because God's king is the descendant of the great King David, who was also born there. So again, our question, what does the evidence say about who is the real king? Now, King Herod didn't know his Bible, but the religious experts did. Do you remember verse 4? When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. In Bethlehem in Judea. So which is the real king? Herod in Jerusalem, or the baby born in Bethlehem? So we've got a choice to make. We've got King Herod looking grumpy and angry and wanting to kill all the people. King Herod, is he the real king? Or is it the baby? Is it Herod? Or is it... Is it Herod? Or is it the baby? Which is the real... Remember, the real king matters. Is it Herod or the baby? How are we going to find out? Well, God has given us the evidence, isn't it? What did God say in his word? The real king will come out of Bethlehem. So here is the evidence that Jesus, the baby, is the king that God had promised. But God's promises also said something else about how we could recognize the real king when he came. What was the last line from those two Old Testament readings, promises? For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Now, it's easy to be a ruler, isn't it? Can you be a ruler for us, Jamie? Yeah, there we go. You just got to be very straight, don't you? That's how to be a ruler. Except I don't think that's what God meant when he said there was going to be a ruler. Okay, well done. You can grab a seat. Thanks, King. I don't think that's what God meant when he talked about a ruler. Being a ruler means being in charge. And remember, King Herod loved being in charge. He wants to make sure everybody does what he says. But this ruler that God promises is going to be something different as well. He is also going to be a shepherd. God's word said the real king will shepherd my people Israel. Now the shepherd is still in charge, isn't he? Or she? The shepherd doesn't ask the sheep, where would you like to go today? Would you prefer to eat grass or hay? Hay, please. No. The shepherd is in charge, the shepherd leads, and the sheep follow. But what else does the shepherd do? Shepherd protects the sheep, guides them, feeds them, teaches them not to do silly things. And the real king promised in God's word is both a ruler and a shepherd. So clearly the real king is not Herod, because we know he was nasty and killed lots of people. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Even God doesn't want King Herod hearing where the baby is. And God warns the Magi, don't go there. But as the story in Matthew's account goes on, we see Jesus doing exactly the sorts of things that a shepherd does. He feeds people, both physically and spiritually. He heals people from illness and the illness of sin, our rebellion against God. He teaches people, he protects people. In fact, he even says, I am the good shepherd. So God revealed in his word that he'd send a king, and this king would be born in Bethlehem. And this king, the real king, wouldn't just be a ruler, he would also be a shepherd. Where does all the evidence point? Jesus is the real king, revealed in God's word. There's one more important piece of evidence. As the story goes on, we discover that not only is this baby Jesus God's king, he is also God himself. We'll see in just a moment that these magi bow down and worship him. Worship is something you only do to God. Now, if God's word reveals the king, and the king is God, then God's word reveals God. See, the Magi couldn't find God on their own, could they? King Herod didn't know where to turn. Even the chief priests and teachers of the law wouldn't have had a clue if God hadn't said in his word, this is how I'm going to come among you. It's kind of popular today to talk about being on a spiritual journey and looking for God. But look at the Magi. They are like professional religious seekers. And they're committed. This journey might have taken them 3 or 4 months. 3 months on a stinky camel is way more committed than most people I know. And yet without God sending his star and revealing himself in his word, they would have had no idea where to go, would they? If they can't find their way to God on their own, then what hope do you or I have? The Magi show us that we don't get to God by just looking into the heavens or marveling at creation or by thinking very hard. Those things might tell us something about God. But no, God is made known in his word as it speaks to us of his King Jesus. For the Magi, they seem to have been very, very religious. But their religion couldn't provide a way for them to be in right relationship with God, for their sin to be forgiven. But how kind of God to speak to them in a language they understood, the language of the stars. And then for them to hear the promises of God in his word so they could actually meet God. I think when we read this part of the Bible, we often think of all the Magi doing all the actions. I mean, there's lots of great actions, isn't there? They're looking at the stars. They're packing their bags. They're riding their camels. And they're riding their camels some more because it was such a long way. And then they speak to Herod and they offer their gifts and they bow in worship. And all of those things are true. The Magi do all of those things. But none of those things are even possible, wouldn't have mattered one little bit without one more action. Can you do this one with me? That's what God does as he calls to them in his word. And it's what God does today as he calls to us in his word. We're going to sing The Joy of Christmas. What kind of gift do you think is appropriate for a king? I Googled ultimate Christmas gift this week just to get a taste of what I might be receiving on Friday. For £7,000, you can give someone a giant infrared relaxation clam that they can climb into and have the worries of 2020 just fade away. I wonder if we'd like that. Or you could give a 24-carat gold custom-made set of shoelaces. Maybe a king would like those, only £15,000. Other options include a golf cart in the shape of the Batmobile, 20,000 quid, or a 52-carat diamond dog collar for around 3 million. Better clear some space under the Christmas tree. Is that the kind of thing that the Magi are going to offer to this new king? Well, let's see how the story continues. We just heard it read. After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. Now, this is miraculous, isn't it? This isn't what stars normally do. Matthew is making sure that we are aware God is at work. I think if it was today, God would probably use one of those red pin drop things like in Google Maps, but a really big one in the sky. But did you notice? We're not told much about the Magi's journey. We don't know if they had camels. We don't even know how many there were, although the Christmas cards always picture 3, don't they? It's what they do next that Matthew wants us to notice. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense and myrrh. They bowed down and worshipped him. Now, it was my birthday last week, and I got some gifts, not gold, but some chili peppers and some chocolate and a new pen, and I was all very pleased, but nobody worshipped me. Here it's Jesus' birthday and the Magi worshipped him. So now I'm wondering if I'm feeling a bit left out. Should I have expected people to worship me on my birthday? Well, of course not. As we noted already, worship is reserved only for God. To worship someone else is to put that person or that thing in the place of God. It's always a terrible idea. So when the Magi worship baby Jesus, they are recognising him as God. And Matthew's language for their giving of the gold and frankincense and myrrh is the way you describe offering a sacrifice. This isn't just like me getting presents on my birthday. This is God laying in the world that he made and people recognising who he is. Gold and frankincense and myrrh are the kinds of gifts that you would give to a king in ancient times. And of course, if we know how the story of Jesus' life continues, we might remember that myrrh is associated with his death and burial. So already at the very beginning of his life, we're getting a taste of what is to come. Worship just means recognising God's worth, responding to God in a way that acknowledges what he's done to us, what he's done for us in King Jesus. Now, we might wonder why Matthew has included this story in his gospel account. What's the point? Well, remember, they're foreigners. Foreigners in the same way that you and I probably are. Not many of us are Jewish. We're not from among the ancient people of God. We're outsiders. And yet the birth of Jesus is good news for the Magi. God calls them, God reveals himself to them, and they, though they're foreigners from outside Israel, they worship Jesus, God's true King. In Psalm 72, written nearly 1,000 years before Jesus, God had said, "May all kings bow down to him and all nations serve him." Now, it's passages like that that's led to the Magi being known as the three kings. The point is that Jesus is not just king for one particular group of people at one moment in history. This king is king for all the world. The right response to this king, no matter who you are, no matter where you live, no matter how many camels you own, regardless of how much gold you have, is worship. Now, we probably don't have much gold and frankincense and myrrh, I imagine, but to worship Jesus is to do exactly the same thing as these Magi did. To recognize who Jesus is and to respond appropriately. Like I said, the costly things that we have are probably not gold and what have you. What's costly for us? Well, my time, my priorities, the way I order my life, the way people think of me, that's costly if it changes, isn't it? To worship Jesus is to recognize that he is worth giving up all of those things because of who he is, the King, God come into the world, and because of what he's done, most especially by dying in my place because I've rebelled against and ignored God, what the Bible calls sin. Perhaps this Christmas, for the first time ever, we need to recognize that it's right for us to worship Jesus. King Herod claimed he wanted to worship, but actually he rejected Jesus, going so far as to try and kill him, as the next section of Matthew's Gospel tells us. Now, few of us go that far, but we might still try and keep Jesus at arm's length. Sure, we do the whole Christmas thing, presents, food, trees, days off, but we don't want Jesus. That is, we don't want the gift that God gives. Those other things, presents, food, holidays, they're just the wrapping. The real present is Jesus. Imagine getting all caught up in the wrapping and ignoring the present. Well, actually, we've seen people do that, haven't we? That's what babies do, isn't it? They think the wrapping is better than the present because babies don't understand. But wise people put the wrapping aside. They accept the gift and they worship Jesus, the King and the gift of Christmas. We're going to sing again.